You know the type. You have encountered them before, possibly more than once, possibly enough times that the pattern has started to feel like something is fundamentally wrong with your radar. They arrive with an intensity that feels like recognition, a charm that seems tailor-made for you, an attention so focused and so precise that it feels less like being seen and more like being known, as if this person has been looking for you specifically, as if the connection is something rare and destined rather than something ordinary and new. And for a period that varies from weeks to years, you are held inside that warmth. You organize your sense of self around it. You begin to believe that this is what love is supposed to feel like, this intoxicating mixture of being chosen and being seen. And then gradually or suddenly, the warmth withdraws. The attention that was once so precisely focused turns diffuse, or conditional, or simply absent. The person who seemed to see you so clearly begins to see through you instead, to look past you toward what they need from you, toward how you reflect them, toward whether you are still serving the function that made you valuable. And you are left with a specific kind of confusion that is unlike the confusion of ordinary heartbreak. Because ordinary heartbreak hurts but makes sense, this confusion is different. It carries a quality of having been deceived, not by the other person alone, but somehow by your own perception, your own certainty, your own gut feeling that told you this was real. If this experience is familiar, if it has the quality of something recognized rather than merely understood, then you are in the right place. And what you are about to encounter may be the most uncomfortable thing you have ever been invited to consider about yourself. Not because you are broken, not because you are deficient in judgment or wisdom or self-awareness, but because the pattern of attracting narcissistic personalities is almost never random and almost never simply bad luck. It is, in the Jungian sense, a conversation between your unconscious and theirs. And like all unconscious conversations, it carries information, painful information, necessary information, about something in your own interior that has not yet been fully seen. Carl Jung never used the word narcissist in the clinical sense we use it today, but he spent his entire career mapping the psychological structures that produce the dynamic you have been living. The complementary relationship between the person who has learned to efface their own needs and the person who has learned to fill every available space with theirs. He understood that these two types find each other not by accident but by design. Unconscious design, the kind that operates below the level of choice, below the level of preference, at the level of what the psyche needs in order to continue its own incomplete business. And his understanding of why this happens is both more disturbing and more liberating than anything the self-help literature has offered. This video is not a clinical diagnosis of narcissism. It is not a validation exercise designed to confirm that the people who hurt you were disordered and you were innocent. Both of those framings, while sometimes useful, ultimately leave you exactly where you started, waiting for the next one to arrive. What this video offers instead is Jung's most uncomfortable idea, that the narcissist you keep finding is, in a very specific and very important sense, a narcissist you helped create, not in the other person, but in the dynamic between you. And understanding your role in that dynamic is the only thing that will actually change it. The word narcissism has become so widely used and so loosely applied that it has lost most of its psychological precision. In ordinary conversation, it has come to mean something close to selfishness. A person who talks too much about themselves, who lacks empathy, who prioritizes their own needs without apparent concern for others. This description captures something real, but it misses the deeper structure, the psychological architecture beneath the behavior that Jung's framework helps illuminate in ways that purely behavioral descriptions cannot. Narcissism in its psychological depth is not primarily a problem of too much self. It is a problem of a false self, a constructed identity built to compensate for an underlying experience of profound inadequacy, emptiness, or shame. The narcissistic personality does not love themselves too much. They have, in fact, never developed a stable relationship with themselves at all. What they have developed instead is a performance, a grandiose external presentation designed to generate, continuously and from external sources, the sense of value and reality that a securely developed self generates from within. The admiration, the attention, the compliance of others, These are not luxuries for the narcissistic personality. They are oxygen. Without them, the performance collapses, and what is revealed beneath it is not a person who simply has an inflated opinion of themselves, but a person who has almost no stable opinion of themselves at all. Jung would have recognized in this structure the failed development of the self, the capital S self that represents the integrated totality of the psyche, including both its conscious and unconscious dimensions. The development of the self requires a specific kind of early relational experience, an environment in which the child's authentic emotional states are met with attunement rather than performance anxiety, in which love is not contingent on reflecting back the parent's own needs, in which the child is allowed to be genuinely themselves, including their difficult, inconvenient, unglamorous selves, and to find that self met with acceptance. When this environment is absent, the self does not develop. A substitute develops in its place, a persona so constructed, so heavily armored, so dependent on external validation that it functions as a kind of psychological prosthetic for the missing inner life. What makes this understanding important for our purposes, for understanding why certain people keep attracting narcissistic personalities, is the recognition that the narcissistic false self has a very specific hunger. It hunts unconsciously and with remarkable precision for people who will feed it, not people who will challenge it, not people who will see through it, not people who will require it to be genuinely vulnerable, people who will provide what it most needs, a steady supply of admiration, compliance, and reflected worth. And the people most likely to provide this supply are, almost always, people whose own psychological development has produced the opposite wound. Not too much false self, but too little acknowledged self. Not the inability to attune to others, but the compulsive over-attuning that comes from a lifetime of prioritizing others' emotional realities over their own. This is the complementary wound at the heart of the narcissistic dynamic. The pairing that Jung's framework helps explain with a clarity that behavioral descriptions cannot reach. The narcissistic personality and the person who keeps attracting them are not random opposites. They are psychologically matched, two people whose wounds fit together like a key in a lock. The narcissist provides the intensity, the chosenness, the feeling of being seen in a way that the other person's own suppressed needs desperately want. The empath provides the mirroring, the attunement, the steady supply of attention and worth that the narcissist's empty core requires. Neither person is conscious of this exchange. Both experience it as love, or as the closest thing to love they have known, and both are in different ways trying to complete something that was left unfinished a very long time ago. To understand Jung's most uncomfortable idea about narcissistic attraction, we need to return to the concept of the shadow, but approach it from a direction that most discussions of shadow work never reach. The shadow, as previously discussed, contains everything we have rejected about ourselves, every quality, impulse, and dimension of our personality that was deemed incompatible with the identity we constructed for social and familial survival. What is less often explored is that the shadow does not only contain what we consider our worst qualities, it also contains what we were forced to disown, because those qualities were incompatible with the specific role our environment assigned to us. The person who consistently attracts narcissistic personalities has almost always been shaped by an early environment that required, explicitly or implicitly, the suppression of their own needs, their own voice, their own claim to space and attention. This may have been a parent whose own emotional fragility meant that the child's needs were too much, too inconvenient, too threatening to the parent's stability. It may have been a family system in which being good meant being invisible, in which taking up space, asserting preferences, or placing demands on others was experienced as selfish or dangerous. It may have been the subtler, more chronic experience of being most loved when least troublesome, when most compliant, most accommodating, most skilled at reading the emotional weather of others and adjusting accordingly. In this environment, the natural human needs for recognition, for self-assertion, for the experience of one's own desires as legitimate and worthy, these do not disappear. They go into the shadow. The child learns to meet others' needs while disowning their own, learns to attune to others' emotional states with exquisite precision while losing contact with their own, learns that their worth is located in their usefulness to others, in their capacity to make others feel good, rather than in anything intrinsic to themselves. This is not weakness. It is a sophisticated adaptive strategy, and it produces in adulthood a person of remarkable empathy, attunement, and relational sensitivity, who has as its shadow a completely undeveloped relationship with their own needs, desires, and claim to be seen. Here is where Jung's uncomfortable insight lands with full force. The narcissistic personality is not drawn to this person despite their suppressed self-assertion. They are drawn to them because of it. The person who has learned to efface their own needs creates unconsciously a relational vacuum, a space of such consistent attunement to others and suppression of self that it functions as a perfect container for someone who needs endless amounts of exactly that. The narcissistic personality, whose own early environment required them to develop an inflated false self at the expense of genuine inner life, finds in this person what they have always been looking for: a mirror that reflects back only what they need to see, a presence that consistently prioritizes their reality over its own, a relationship in which their hunger for significance is reliably fed. But Jung would push further still. The suppressed self-assertion, the exiled sense of one's own importance, the disowned need to be seen and recognized, these are not simply absent in the person who attracts narcissists. They are present in the shadow, and they are being projected. When the narcissistic personality arrives with their grandiosity, their certainty of their own significance, their comfortable occupation of space and attention, the person whose own needs for significance are suppressed experiences something that feels like recognition, like completion, like the embodiment of something they have been missing. They are, in a very real sense, falling in love with their own shadow, with the exiled part of themselves that knows how to take up space, how to insist on its own reality, how to exist without apology. And until that shadow is claimed directly, rather than projected onto a partner who will ultimately use it as a weapon, the pattern will continue. One of the most destabilizing aspects of understanding the narcissistic dynamic through a Jungian lens is the recognition that the dynamic requires two participants, and that your participation, however unconscious and however well-intentioned, is not passive. This is the idea that most people resist most strongly, and understandably so. When you have been genuinely hurt, when your needs were genuinely dismissed, when your reality was genuinely distorted by someone whose primary concern was their own reflection, being asked to examine your own role in the dynamic can feel like a second violation. It can feel like being told that the harm you experienced was your own fault. That is not what is being said here, but the distinction requires careful articulation. The role you play in the narcissistic dynamic is not the role of victim in the simple sense. It is the role of enabler, not in the moralistic sense of someone who knowingly tolerates bad behavior, but in the psychological sense of someone whose adaptive patterns create the precise conditions that the narcissistic personality requires to maintain their false self. When you consistently absorb their emotional volatility without complaint, when you consistently prioritize their interpretation of events over your own, when you apologize for having needs that inconvenience them, when you work harder and harder to earn back warmth that was withdrawn for reasons you were never clearly given. In each of these moments, you are not simply being kind or patient or loving. You are, unconsciously, confirming the narcissist's unconscious belief that their reality is more real than yours, and that your function is to serve theirs. Jung described the psychological phenomenon at work here through the concept of participation mystique, a term he borrowed from anthropology to describe a state in which two people become so psychologically merged that they lose the boundary between their separate realities. Picture a concrete moment. You are telling a story, and halfway through you notice their attention drifting, their expression shifting toward impatience. Without conscious decision, you shorten the story. You redirect the conversation toward them. You smile and ask something about their day. Later, you cannot remember what you were going to say. This is not a single dramatic event. It is the accumulation of hundreds of these micro-contractions, each one feeling like generosity, each one quietly ceding a little more of your own reality to maintain the peace. And the person whose reality contracts does not experience this as a loss of self. They experience it as love. as the willingness to prioritize the relationship above their own needs, as the kind of devotion that should eventually be recognized and reciprocated. The reason it is never reciprocated is not simply that the narcissistic person is incapable of genuine care, though their capacity for it may be genuinely limited. It is that the dynamic itself, once established, has no internal mechanism for producing reciprocity. Reciprocity would require the narcissistic person to encounter the other as a genuine other, as a person with a reality as valid and as demanding of respect as their own. But the dynamic was constructed precisely to prevent this encounter. You have, without intending to, created a relational structure that confirms their fundamental belief that their reality is central and others exist to serve it. And the more skillfully you adapt to this structure, the more efficiently you read their moods, anticipate their needs, modulate your own responses to maintain harmony, the more completely you confirm it. This is not an indictment of your character. The adaptive patterns that produce this role were developed for reasons that made complete sense in the context in which they were formed. They were, in their original context, the best available response to an environment that required them. The problem is that they have been carried forward into adulthood and applied in contexts where they are no longer necessary and where their effect is the opposite of what was intended. You learn to efface yourself in order to maintain connection. In the narcissistic dynamic, effacing yourself destroys the possibility of genuine connection, because genuine connection requires two present, distinct, equally real people, and the role you have been playing allows for only one. The beginning of a relationship with a narcissistic personality is almost never recognizable as the beginning of something harmful. It is recognizable as the opposite, as the beginning of something finally, completely right. The experience commonly described as love bombing, the intense early attention, the apparent deep understanding, the rapid escalation of intimacy and significance, does not feel manipulative from inside it. It feels like being seen. It feels like the specific relief of having your particular way of being in the world met with appreciation rather than inconvenience. And for someone who has spent a significant portion of their life making themselves smaller, quieter, less demanding, being chosen with such evident enthusiasm can feel less like a romantic development and more like a homecoming. Jung's framework explains why this is not merely a matter of deception. The narcissistic personality is genuinely gifted at the early stages of intimacy, not because they are calculated performers, though calculation is often present, but because their psychological survival has depended on their ability to read others' needs and reflect them back in compelling forms. The same attunement to others that drives their hunger for narcissistic supply makes them, in the early stages of a relationship, exceptionally attuned to what the other person most needs to hear, most needs to feel, most needs to have confirmed about themselves. They are not manufacturing a false impression entirely from nothing. They are perceiving what is really there, your genuine qualities, your genuine capacities, your genuine worth, and reflecting them back at an intensity that feels, after a lifetime of having those qualities overlooked, like being finally and completely understood. There is a deeper dimension to why the beginning feels like coming home that goes beyond the mechanics of love bombing. For the person whose own needs for significance have been suppressed into the shadow, the narcissistic personality's easy occupation of significance, their comfort with being important, being central, being the person around whom others orient, carries a specific fascination. It is not simply that this person is compelling. It is that they embody something exiled. They live openly and without apparent conflict in a way of being that your own development required you to suppress. The grandiosity that will later become suffocating feels in the beginning like vitality. The self-assurance that will later reveal itself as an inability to tolerate challenge feels, in the beginning, like the kind of groundedness you have always wished you could access in yourself. This is projection functioning at full force and at its most seductive. You are not simply responding to who this person is. You are responding to what they are carrying for you, to the projected contents of your own shadow that you have not yet been able to claim directly. The relationship feels fated, not because it is destined, but because the unconscious is doing what it always does, generating intense emotion around the contents that most need to be integrated. The feeling of having finally found someone who understands you is, in part, the feeling of finally encountering your own suppressed self in a form that feels approachable, in someone else's face, someone else's body, someone else's unapologetic existence. The cruelty of the narcissistic dynamic is that this encounter, which begins as a kind of psychological homecoming, becomes a trap. The qualities you were drawn to, the certainty, the self-importance, the comfortable occupation of space, reveal themselves over time not as strength, but as rigidity. The apparent depth turns out to be a hall of mirrors. The understanding that felt so precise in the beginning was not understanding of you. It was a skilled reading of your needs in service of their own. And by the time this becomes undeniable, you have reorganized your sense of self significantly around the relationship. You have allowed your own reality to contract in service of theirs. And the project of reclaiming what was contracted, of returning to yourself, is the work that the rest of this video is about. Jung believed that what we cannot see in ourselves we will inevitably encounter in the world. That the unconscious, unable to integrate its own contents directly, will project them onto external figures, and then relate to those contents as if they belong to the other person rather than to the self. This principle, applied to the narcissistic dynamic, produces an insight that is as precise as it is uncomfortable. The qualities in the narcissistic person that cause the most pain, the ones that feel most specifically designed to wound you, are almost always the qualities that are most directly related to your own suppressed contents. The wound that the narcissist inflicts is not random. It lands where the pre-existing wound already lives. The person whose early environment required them to suppress their anger will find that the narcissistic partner's easy expression of rage is among the most destabilizing things they experience in the relationship. Not simply because it is frightening, though it may be, but because somewhere beneath the fear is a response that is more disturbing. Recognition, the anger they could never express, the indignation they learned to swallow, the entitlement to their own emotional reality that was trained out of them. All of this lives in the shadow, and the narcissist's unrestrained expression of it produces a response that is as close to envy as it is to fear. A part of the person witnessing the rage is thinking, "I wish I could do that." And the shame of that thought drives it deeper into the unconscious, making it even less available for direct integration. The person whose early environment required them to be extraordinarily attentive to others' needs, to read emotional weather, to adjust and accommodate and smooth over, will find that the narcissist's complete indifference to others' emotional states is among the most confusing elements of the relationship, because the complementary opposite is also their shadow. Somewhere beneath the compulsive caretaking is a part of this person that is exhausted, that wants, desperately and guiltily, to simply exist without monitoring, without managing, without making everyone around them comfortable. The narcissist's breezy self-centeredness, which is genuinely harmful, also carries a quality of the very thing this person most secretly longs for: the freedom to exist without being responsible for others' emotional experiences. And the shame of recognizing this longing keeps it in the shadow, where it cannot be addressed directly. These shadow dynamics explain why leaving the narcissistic relationship is so much more complex than it appears from outside. It is not simply a matter of recognizing that the person is harmful and making the rational decision to leave. The relationship, despite or because of its harm, has been serving multiple unconscious functions simultaneously. It has been providing the intensity and chosenness that the suppressed need for significance craves. It has been providing a living embodiment of the shadow qualities that cannot yet be claimed directly. It has been providing, in the very experience of being diminished, a confirmation of the deepest wound. The belief that one's own needs and reality are secondary, that somehow feels more honest than the alternative. Leaving means not only losing the relationship, it means losing the unconscious functions the relationship was serving, and the psyche does not relinquish those functions without a fight. Understanding the specific wound that matches is not an exercise in self-blame. It is an exercise in precision, in identifying as exactly as possible what the narcissistic dynamic has been reflecting about your own interior. Because the reflection, however distorted and however painful, contains information. It points toward the shadow contents that need to be reclaimed, The anger that needs to be acknowledged, the need for significance that needs to be allowed, the longing for freedom from compulsive caretaking that needs to be honored. Every painful quality in the narcissistic person that has had particular power to wound you is a signpost pointing towards something in your own unconscious that is waiting to be seen. And seeing it, directly and honestly, is the beginning of the only kind of change that actually disrupts the pattern. Jung developed a specific vocabulary for the psychological states that the narcissistic dynamic produces in both participants. Vocabulary that clarifies the dynamic in ways that purely relational descriptions cannot. He used the term inflation to describe a state in which the ego has expanded beyond its actual boundaries, has taken on, identified with, and experiences as its own the contents that properly belong to the larger self, or to the collective psyche. The inflated ego experiences itself as more significant, more central, more uniquely important than the reality of one particular human life warrants. It has confused the ego with the self, has mistaken the part for the whole, and organized its entire existence around maintaining that confusion. Think of a specific moment you have probably lived. You express a need, something small, something reasonable, and the atmosphere in the room shifts immediately. Their face tightens, the warmth withdraws, and within minutes you are apologizing, not for a wrong you committed, but for the simple act of having had a need in the first place. That moment, that specific familiar contraction, is the deflation responding to the inflation. The narcissistic personality, in Jungian terms, is a study in inflation. The grandiosity, the sense of special destiny, the rage that emerges when reality fails to confirm their centrality. These are not symptoms of too much self-esteem. They are symptoms of an ego that has inflated to fill the space where a genuine self was never allowed to develop. The inflation is compensatory. It exists to cover an experience of emptiness and worthlessness that the person cannot consciously tolerate. The grandiosity is the size of the void it is covering. And the hunger for narcissistic supply, for continuous external confirmation, is the hunger of an inflation that must be continuously fed because it has no internal source of sustenance. Deflation is the complementary state, the condition in which the ego has contracted below its actual dimensions, has ceded to others the worth and significance and claim to existence that properly belong to it. The deflated ego does not experience itself as less important than it is in some philosophical sense. It experiences itself as genuinely less real than others, as having needs that are less legitimate, opinions that are less valid, existence that requires more justification. This is not humility, which is an accurate assessment of one's actual dimensions. It is a distortion in the opposite direction from inflation, and it is, in the Jungian framework, just as much a failure of authentic self-development as its opposite. The reason the inflated and deflated personalities find each other is not difficult to understand once the framework is clear. Inflation requires deflation to sustain itself. It needs a relational partner whose contracted sense of self creates the space for the inflated self to expand into. And deflation, paradoxically, is drawn to inflation, not because it wants to be diminished further, but because the inflated person's confident occupation of significance provides temporarily the experience of worth by proximity. Being chosen by someone who seems so sure of their own importance feels like confirmation that one has value. Being in the orbit of someone whose sense of self is so large provides, for a person whose own sense of self is so contracted, a temporary experience of existing within a larger reality. The problem is that the larger reality is not their own, and proximity to another person's inflation does not cure one's own deflation. It deepens it. Jung's prescription for both states was the same: the development of a genuine relationship with the self, the actual, bounded, neither inflated nor deflated reality of who one is. For the narcissistic personality, this means the terrifying work of allowing the inflation to collapse, of tolerating the emptiness beneath the grandiosity, long enough for genuine inner life to begin developing there. For the person who keeps attracting narcissists, it means the equally terrifying work of allowing the deflation to lift, of tolerating the exposure of claiming one's own worth, one's own significance, one's own reality as genuinely real and genuinely worth defending. Both processes are painful. Both require encountering what the inflation or deflation was protecting against, and both, done with honesty and sufficient support, produce something that the dynamic itself never could. A person who is actually, reliably, there. There is a concept in popular psychology, the empath, that has become increasingly central to discussions of narcissistic dynamics. The empath in this framework is the natural opposite and natural victim of the narcissist, someone of exceptional sensitivity and compassion who is repeatedly targeted by narcissistic personalities precisely because of their openness and their capacity for care. This framework contains something true, but it also contains a significant blind spot, one that Jung's psychology illuminates with uncomfortable precision. The blind spot is the empath's shadow. And the empath's shadow is, in many cases, the very thing that keeps the pattern running. The qualities that constitute the empath identity, the exceptional sensitivity to others, the deep capacity for compassion, the instinctive prioritization of others' emotional experiences, are genuine and valuable. But like all qualities that have been elevated to the level of identity, they have a shadow side that is rarely examined. The person who identifies strongly as an empath has almost always organized their sense of self around their capacity to feel for and with others. This organization is not neutral. It produces, as its necessary complement, a suppressed relationship with certain qualities that are incompatible with the empath identity. The capacity for self-interest, for healthy self-assertion, for the willingness to prioritize one's own needs even at the cost of another's comfort. These are not bad qualities. They are necessary ones. And in the empath, they live in the shadow. The shadow of the empath is, in the Jungian framework, the very qualities that the narcissistic personality displays most conspicuously: the comfort with self-interest, the easy prioritization of one's own needs, the willingness to exist at the center of one's own reality without constant reference to how that existence affects others. This is why, as discussed in earlier chapters, the narcissistic personality carries a specific fascination for the empath that goes beyond the mechanics of love bombing. The narcissist is living openly in the empath's shadow. They are demonstrating, without apparent conflict, the exact way of being that the empath's own development required them to suppress. And the combination of fascination, recognition, and projected longing that this produces is experienced as an irresistible attraction. There is also a subtler shadow dimension to the empath dynamic that is worth naming honestly. The empath identity, however genuinely felt, can function as a way of experiencing power without claiming power, of being central without appearing to seek centrality. The person who is always the most sensitive one in the room, the one who feels most deeply, the one whose capacity for care is the defining feature of their identity. This person occupies a specific kind of importance. They are the emotional center of their relationships. Their attunement, their care, their sensitivity makes others dependent on them in ways that the empath rarely acknowledges. The role of the empath is not as powerless as it presents itself, and the shadow of that unacknowledged power, the ways in which the caretaker role is also a form of control, the ways in which hyper-attunement to others can function as a mechanism for managing them, is part of what needs to be examined for the pattern to genuinely change. None of this is intended to diminish the reality of the harm that narcissistic dynamics cause, or to suggest that sensitivity and compassion are not genuine virtues. They are, but virtues that have been elevated to the level of identity become rigid, become forms of self-limitation as much as self-expression. The empath who cannot access their own healthy self-interest is as incomplete a person as the narcissist who cannot access genuine empathy. Jung's framework insists on wholeness, on the integration of both poles, rather than the identification with one and the projection of the other. And wholeness in this context means developing the capacity to be both genuinely caring and genuinely self-interested, both deeply feeling and directly assertive, both sensitive to others and unapologetically present to oneself. The work of breaking the narcissistic attraction pattern is, at its deepest level, the work of shadow integration, the gradual reclamation of the qualities that were projected onto the narcissistic personality and the qualities that were suppressed in service of the caretaker role. This work cannot be done by simply deciding to make different choices, though different choices will eventually follow. It cannot be done by developing a more comprehensive list of red flags to watch for, though awareness of patterns is useful. It must be done at the level where the pattern actually lives, in the unconscious, through the slow and often uncomfortable process of making what is hidden visible and what is projected owned. The first step of this reclamation is identifying, as specifically as possible, which qualities in the narcissistic person produce the strongest attraction in the beginning. Not the qualities that eventually caused harm, those are usually easier to name. The qualities that felt magnetic, compelling, like something you had been missing. The self-assurance, the easy entitlement to space and attention, the comfort with being important, the willingness to assert desires without apparent guilt. These are your projected shadow contents, the exiled parts of yourself that you encountered, briefly and in distorted form, in another person's face. Naming them is the beginning of owning them. The second step is developing a conscious relationship with those qualities in yourself, not in the inflated, unmodulated form in which they appear in the narcissistic personality, but in the integrated, appropriately bounded form that genuine psychological development produces. This means learning, concretely and practically, to take up space without apology, to assert preferences without immediately moderating them in response to others' reactions, to experience your own needs as legitimate without requiring them to be invisible or secondary, to exist, occasionally and without guilt, at the center of your own reality. These are not grandiose acts. They are the ordinary self-possession that was denied in the early environment, and that has been projected outward ever since. The third step is examining the caretaker role, not to abandon care or sensitivity, which are genuine strengths, but to understand the ways in which the caretaker role has also been a hiding place. A way of being important without claiming importance. A way of having impact without taking responsibility for the impact. A way of managing others' emotional experiences while never having to be fully responsible for your own. This examination is uncomfortable because it requires acknowledging that the empath identity, for all its genuine virtues, has also served certain defensive functions, has protected against the specific vulnerability of claiming one's own needs, desires, and reality as equally real and equally worthy of attention as anyone else's. The fourth step is grief. The grief of the original wound that made all of this necessary, and the grief of the relationships that were shaped by it, the anger that was never allowed, the needs that were never met, the self that was contracted to maintain connection and never fully recovered. This grief is not linear, and it is not quick, but it is, in the Jungian framework, the most direct route to genuine change, because it completes internally the emotional business that the narcissistic dynamic was attempting to complete externally. When the original wound has been genuinely mourned, when the loss of what was needed and not received has been fully felt rather than endlessly reenacted, the unconscious pressure to find external compensation for it begins to diminish. And with that diminishment comes something that is difficult to imagine from inside the pattern, but becomes unmistakably real on the other side of the work. The first genuine glimpse of what a different kind of relationship actually feels like. That glimpse, that first experience of a relational exchange that does not require you to contract in order to maintain it, is what this chapter is about. What becomes possible after this work is not a perfect relationship, not a relationship without difficulty, without the ordinary friction of two genuinely separate people with genuinely different needs trying to genuinely meet each other. What becomes possible is something more valuable than perfection, a relationship between two people who are actually present, who have enough relationship with their own interior that they can show up as themselves, rather than as the role the dynamic assigns them. A relationship in which one person does not need to inflate, and the other does not need to deflate. A relationship in which the exchange of care does not require the erasure of the self who is caring. Jung described the goal of psychological development in relationships not as the finding of a perfect partner, but as the development of a person who can be a genuine partner, someone whose own psychological completion does not depend on the other person performing a specific function in the unconscious drama. The person who has done this work no longer needs their partner to carry their shadow for them. They can acknowledge their own self-interest without projecting it. They can feel their own grandiosity and choose not to act on it. They can experience their own need for significance without requiring another person to confirm it continuously. They are, in the specific Jungian sense, more whole, and therefore less compulsively attached to the particular type of person whose wholeness they were borrowing. This does not mean becoming cold or self-sufficient in the defended sense. The qualities that constituted the empath's genuine strengths, the sensitivity, the capacity for attunement, the depth of care, do not disappear. They become available in a different form, no longer as compulsive responses driven by the need to manage others' emotional states, but as genuine choices made by a person who has enough self-possession to choose when and how and for whom to extend them. Care offered from wholeness feels different from care offered from depletion. It has different limits, it produces different relationships, and it attracts over time different people. People who can receive care without weaponizing it, who can be genuinely seen without requiring constant mirroring, who can show up in their own right rather than as the answer to someone else's projected need. Jung believed that every relationship, however painful, carries within it an invitation toward greater psychological development, toward the integration of the contents that the relationship was reflecting and the growth that the pain was demanding. The narcissistic dynamic, for all its harm, is no exception. The pattern of attraction it produces points with uncomfortable precision toward exactly the shadow contents that most need to be reclaimed. The specific pain it inflicts lands with uncomfortable precision on exactly the wounds that most need to be healed. This does not justify the harm. It does not make the harm acceptable. But it does mean that the experience is not wasted, that it contains within its difficulty the specific information needed to change not just the next relationship, but the relationship with oneself that all relationships are ultimately a reflection of. If you have recognized your own pattern in this video, if the dynamic described here has the quality of something lived rather than merely described, then you are already doing the most important thing. You are looking at what most people spend their entire lives looking away from. The narcissist you keep finding is not a force of nature, not a mark of your deficiency, not evidence that love is not available to you. They are a message from your own unconscious, urgent, uncomfortable, and ultimately pointing you toward the same place every genuine psychological message points: inward, toward the parts of yourself that have been waiting, in the shadow, to come home.